Welcome to the Northern Outer Banks Podcast. From wild horses to small town legends, this is where stories, history, nature, and everyday life come together. Each episode is a front porch conversation with the people and places that give this stretch of North Carolina its soul. Whether you've been coming here for years or just found it on a map, pull up a chair. You're in for a good story. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Northern Outer Banks Podcast. I'm Miles Daniels, and it is a privilege to be joined for this episode by Dr. Whitney Knollenberg, Associate Professor of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management at North Carolina State University. Dr. Knollenberg, if it's okay, I'm going to refer to you as Whitney for this conversation. We've known one another, I think, for 4 years now.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes, Whitney is just fine.
Okay, thank you for that. And that was when you first, I believe you first started your research on sustainable tourism on the Northern Outer Banks and the Northern Outer, or the Outer Banks as a whole. And we'll specifically talk about the Northern Outer Banks. But welcome. It's great to have you with us today.
Happy to be here.
So we were off camera and before we started recording, talking about, I grew up on the Outer Banks and don't remember until recent years really talking about sustainability and the importance of sustainability. I think more importantly for today's conversation, defining what we mean by that. So let's talk about, what does it mean when we say sustainable tourism? And then we'll talk about your work specifically here on the Northern Outer Banks.
Sure. Well, sustainable tourism is a term that's been around for a little while, but it kind of took a bit for it to start being utilized and adopted by those who work in the tourism industry. So not surprising that it's not something that has been on people's radar, but it is really focused on maximizing the positive impacts of tourism for our community and minimizing the negative impacts as much as we can. So tourism, as we see in the Northern Outer Banks, is incredible economic development opportunity, brings in a lot of revenues and taxes for communities where tourism happens. We love to see that, but it can also create a lot of challenges for the natural resources that bring people into these destinations, and sometimes even challenges for those who live and work in the communities where tourism happens. And sustainable tourism is really about finding a way to ensure that we gain the great things that tourism can bring to a place, and trying to minimize those bad things that we want to reduce. So it really takes a shift in mindset, thinking about not just putting heads in beds, but trying to find ways to ensure that we're actually protecting the natural resources, and thinking about those who are actually making tourism happen in these places. So those folks who work in our vacation rental spaces, the folks who work in the restaurants, folks who are running our attractions or our events, those people are really, they are the beating heart of tourism. Without them, it doesn't happen. So we need to be thinking about them and what it takes for them to be able to live and work in these communities that we love to visit. When I think about sustainable tourism, I often tell people, the most unsustainable business is a bankrupt business. We don't want our businesses to struggle. We want them to thrive. We want them to be contributing all the great jobs and taxes and revenues to our communities. And that requires, of course, a reason for people to come and visit a community. So that might be a beautiful beach. It might be the wildlife. It might be the weather that brings people in. But then we also need the people who actually make tourism work. So it's balancing all of those to make sure that we're really thinking about the long-term longevity of the industry, ensuring that it continues to bring in those positive impacts for our communities for many generations to come, and to be making decisions in that sort of long-term mindset. So it does, bring a lot of interesting issues up to from everyone from the business owner to even the guests and the visitors themselves. What are they bringing to these places? Whether that's their money, their time, their love to these places. We're seeing even more travelers these days really thinking about what their impact is on the places that they're visiting. So it really comes from both sides of the equation as well.
And we've talked about this quite a bit on the podcast. Our guest I don't know what the exact number is in terms of repeat guests, but the Outer Banks historically has been a vacation destination where generations and generations of families come back year after year. And even when they're not here, they care about the Outer Banks. They follow the Northern Outer Banks Tourism Bureau on social media, whatever vacation rental management company they're using, they'll follow their social media feeds. They stay engaged long after they've come and gone for typically a 1-week vacation. So in terms of their investment in its future and their investment in making sure that it's sustainable, we're fortunate in that sense. They do. Absolutely. Our guests do care about. So before we go too deeply into your research, what do we mean in terms of, I know there's a lot of conversation around the guest contribution to sustainability. What have you learned and what does that look like? And for those guests who are listening who do care deeply about the Northern Outer Banks, what does that mean?
Sure. Well, I'll kind of break it down into 3 things. When we think about sustainability, we often think about that triple bottom line: people, planet, profit, or economic, environmental, and social. And so I'll kind of give you a tip on each of those for visitors to the Northern Outer Banks. First, economic: spend your money locally. You have a place in this destination that's got incredible locally owned businesses, whether that's Kind Cup Coffee in Corolla, whether that's Carolina Charm over there on the mainland by Harbinger. These places that are locally owned, locally loved, and are the places you can go, not just to get, a great souvenir or something from your travels, but things that'll make it a really unique experience while you're here. One of my favorite things to do, having lived here for the year, would be to drive over to the mainland and go to some of the farm stands. And I know you all have recently done an interview with, it was Morris Farms, right?
Correct.
Great example of a place where, you could probably load up on your peaches or your strawberries before you get to the Outer Banks. But if you wait until you're here in Great Duck County and have a stop at Morris Farms on your way over to the beaches, you're going to have not only great produce, ideally a lot of it locally grown, which is wonderful, but you're also going to have a really unique, wonderful experience, whether they've got their music going in the weekends, whether they've got some local crafts or vendors going on there. Great example of a place that just takes, a little bit more time, but that's all right. You're on island time. Take your time getting there and spend some of that money locally. So thinking about that and kind of being mindful about where your dollars go while you're visiting in the Northern Outer Banks really does go a long way. I feel like today people kind of think, oh, that's cliche, and it's not. It really makes a big difference. So just kind of being mindful of that. In terms of environmental behaviors that they can engage in, definitely look around for some of the great volunteer opportunities with some of our nonprofits in the area. The Wild Horse Fund. We've got also some groups who are, interested in protecting sea turtles and things like that, donating your time or even some of your money to those organizations to help protect some of those natural resources that actually bring us to the Outer Banks is a great way to do that. Also, just kind of be mindful when you're on the beach, picking up your trash. If you see other people's trash, grab that. I love when I'm doing my shell collecting on the beach. I've got my shell bag and I've got my trash bag. And while I'm walking the beaches, if I see something, I just pick it up. And we're lucky here in the Northern Outer Banks. There's definitely other destinations that have a lot more issues with that, but you see it every now and then. And also just always pick up yourself at the end of the day. Have a beautiful day on the beach. Pack it out, pack it in, bring it back with you at the end of the day. So that one I think is sort of the easiest of these things to do. And then socially, for your social impacts, really remember that you're having a great time. You're on vacation, but you are also vacationing probably in someone's backyard. We have people who live here year round. We have people who are working here in the Northern Outer Banks. And for them, they're not on vacation. They're there making sure you have a great vacation. So make sure you're treating those folks with the kindness and respect that you would want someone to treat you with in your home. And again, that sounds maybe kind of cliche, maybe something you think, oh, I'm already doing that. But if you're already doing that, please keep doing that. Be kind, be mindful to those folks who are working really, really hard to make sure you have a magical time in the Outer Banks.
And I think I live downtown Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which is about roughly an hour and a half north of Corolla, and Deborah Malenfant, who's the executive director of Elizabeth City Downtown Incorporated. Often folks will say, "Where can I find Deborah?" I say, "She's the person picking up trash downtown."
Yeah.
And I think that's just the same sort of thing. If you care about something and you love something, do your best to take care of it. As it relates to you, obviously, as we talked about your background in the introduction, affiliated with North Carolina State University based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. What is it that drew you to this region, specifically the Outer Banks? And we'll talk about, I think it's so interesting, that dual perspective of living here for the past year. But what initially drew you to the Outer Banks?
Yeah, great question, Miles. And I love talking about this because it's, I think, a fairly unique story, not to the Outer Banks, but to the world that I live in, the world of academia and higher education. I'm very lucky that my family has always loved the Outer Banks. And you were saying at the top here, this is a place where people come back year after year. Well, we were those people. I grew up in Michigan. And so every fall we would drive from Michigan to the Outer Banks. My dad loves to surf fish, so we would come in October, so good time to surf fish. They would take my sister and I out of school so that we could come down and spend a week on the Outer Banks. And that actually stemmed, my dad grew up coming here as well, back in like the probably mid-50s, early 60s. His parents heard about Avon Pier, and I know that's a bit further south, but that's where they would go. And when it was just a little hotel on the pier, and my grandparents would rent a room, and my dad and uncle would go and fish off the pier, and that was their summer vacation. So they did that for years. My dad absolutely loved it. He, when he was undergraduate at Virginia Tech, he spent his summers out here working at Portugal restaurant, so he could surf and fish and then work in the evenings at Portugal. And he passed that on to me and my sister, and we did the same, growing up here, loving it. And when I did my master's at East Carolina University, we actually had the nation's first Master's of Science program in sustainable tourism. And I was in the first cohort of that program. And I was just delighted that I got to come back to this state that I loved. Like, I had been living in Michigan, went to Michigan State for my undergrad, got to come to ECU for my master's, and I actually did my master's thesis work in Currituck County, looking at second home owners' perceptions of sustainable tourism development. And so that was in 2009. I started that work. So I've been working out here for quite a while, about 15 years in the area, and getting to see things change and some things stay the same, and just being as much as I can a part of the tourism industry out here, even though I'm in Raleigh most of the time. So
I think you would agree, as much as things have changed, and I started seeing a lot of that change happen, especially in the 80s and 90s for various reasons in terms of development across the Outer Banks, and especially the Northern Outer Banks. If you think the mid-80s, we talked about that before, that was the paving of NC-12.
Right.
Leading up to Corolla, so obviously that came with a lot of development. As much of as things have changed over the years, so much of the Outer Banks' identity, its charm, its energy, I think has remained the same. And what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think that a lot of people like yourself, like your family members who grew up here, want to stay here and want to continue to be a part of this community. And I think that really is kind of the backbone, are the people who choose to live here and make this their home, not just a place to visit, but their place to live. And their sort of connection to this place, and not just like the natural beauty of it, which is undeniably incredible. I mean, there are a few places in the world as beautiful as the Outer Banks, but that physical space, that natural environment, I think helps people be connected to this area in a way that you don't see in a place like Raleigh, where I live full time. Having that connection to nature, There's an element of ruggedness to this place where people always, keeping an eye on the ocean, keeping an eye on the winds, keeping an eye on, if there's going to be a storm system coming through, they're always kind of aware of that. And through a lot of the work that I've done out here, we see that the bonds that people have, the social bonds between people who have had families here for hundreds of years or new residents is very, very strong. Sometimes to a point where there's this sort of almost restricting self-reliance out here that people just, they're very independent. They want to do it their own way. They can make it through anything and they can, and many of them do. But I think that connection, this really embedded connection to this place makes it feel different. You don't have as much of that, transient kind of come and go that you might in some other destinations. People want to stay here. They want to make it work. They want to support their neighbors to be able to stay here and make it work. And I think you as a visitor also kind of feel that these people are really connected to this place and they love it in a way that makes others love it too. So,
how would you describe the Outer Banks in general to someone who's never had the opportunity to visit it?
I think it's this place that is remote, but worth the effort. I mean, it's worth the effort to get out here, to make that drive, to where I am up in Corolla, you go over the bridge in Kitty Hawk and you still have almost an hour to go up to Corolla, which some people might say, nah, not worth it. I want something easier. And there are definitely places for that. But here, the drive makes it worth it. The distance makes it worth it to have a place that is incredibly beautiful. I tell people all the time that with living here this year, I live on the edge of the world. You feel like you are on the edge of the world. And, for the United States, at least the Eastern Seaboard, you really are. You can't go any further east, really, unless you're down in Hatteras on the point than where we are. And you living in that liminal space between the ocean and the land connects you to this place. It makes you very aware of your surroundings. And whether you're here for a week or you're here for, like I've been able to be, for a year, you tap into that. And it's almost a sort of primal response to, the ocean it's right there. And in more ways, yes, you could go to the Caribbean or you could go to some of our Florida golf courses, Gulf Coast destinations where the water is smooth and beautiful and you can wade out, way out into the water. You can't do that here. The surf's a little rougher, the water's a lot colder. But being in that space just kind of makes you feel more alive and connected to that. I think because of the intensity of the beach and the ocean and the closeness you have to that. So
across North Carolina, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you would know this. I think last year we were the 5th most popular.
We are.
Is that right?
We are, yes.
That's amazing.
California, New York, Texas, and Florida. Yes, so Florida's number 1.
We're number 5 and continue to grow in popularity. Lots of great options across the state of North Carolina. I know you work very closely with Visit NC in addition to your work with North Carolina State University. In addition to your familiarity, your visiting over the many years, the Outer Banks, what led you here? I know it was around the COVID years, and we have also talked about that on this podcast. Bridges closed around March of 2020. I think they reopened out of an abundance of caution, safety. And no one expected what happened next. Record number of guest visitors coming across those bridges. Supply, demand, you couldn't book a house through that entire year. And I think that's when the partnership, one of our vacation rental management companies here, Twitty and Company, we've had Clark Twitty on as a guest, somehow the connection, the universe brought you together, and that's where it all started, right? Because they had the foresight to say, with this comes a responsibility.
Yes.
A responsibility to not just in terms of environmental, we've talked about that, but responsibility as it relates to the workforce, affordable housing, accessibility, healthcare, all those things that encompass sustainability as you defined it. So let's start there. How did that happen? And then very curious to hear how your 1 year living on the Northern
Sure.
Outer Banks has been. But
Sure.
let's talk about the origins of your research here.
Sure. So yes, it was a partnership was struck between Twitty and Company and the Department of Parks, Recreation, Tourism Management at NC State. And I had the great opportunity in the summer of 2021 to come and live in Corolla. And as you said, Miles, that was an unprecedented moment in tourism. And anyone working in the tourism industry, particularly in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, knew that was a moment that we probably will never see again, that level of intensity of visitation. And quite frankly, I think that's a good thing that we're not going to have that intensity of visitation, because it's very, very hard to accommodate that. And you talk about finding sort of the carrying capacity of a space, and we were finding it in the summer of 21. So that work in the summer of 21, being able to live out here in Corolla and have a front row seat to what it was like for visitors, what it was most importantly like for those working in the industry, those who own businesses in the Outer Banks, was really, really eye-opening for me. It's one thing to sort of teach tourism and read a lot about tourism and work in tourism when things are going and moving along really well. And things were moving along really well in 21. We were making a lot of money. We saw a lot of revenues, which was great. But we were also seeing those pressure points of, hey, we don't have enough people to work in a lot of these places. I would drive up and down Route 12 pretty much every day, meeting with folks during that summer, and I would take pictures of all of the signs under the businesses. And you know what they all said? Hiring.
Yes.
Help wanted.
Or the hours and days open had changed significantly because they just couldn't.
You would see places only open for dinner, or they would only be open, Thursday, Friday, and Monday, Tuesday, things like that, because they just didn't have the staff. You'd try and get into a restaurant, it'd be a 3-hour wait for a table for two. We know in seasonal places like the Outer Banks, you do have to have patience in the high season. Yes, it's going to take a little while to get a table. You kind of learn to set your expectations for that. But 21 was just truly, as I said, unprecedented in terms of the number of people we had here. And what that work, the work that I did that summer was really, like I said, talking to the people in the frontline spaces of tourism at that peak moment of visitation, and learning from them of where we are now with this incredible gift of revenues, but also the incredible pressure. Where do we want to be in the future? What is a sustainable future for tourism look like in the Outer Banks? And you kind of have to be at that almost breaking point to be able to say, oh, maybe we thought we wanted growth here. But we also have to be mindful of where those sort of bumpers are, where the edges are of what we can support. And we were seeing that in 21. So what I heard from those conversations, and in that summer, I think I spoke with over 40 business owners, local leaders, workforce members, nonprofit staff, to learn where those edges are. How do we make sure that we're not threatening the sustainability of this industry that drives the area's economy? We learned that really, it's going to take a shift in mindset. It's going to take thinking about these long-term needs, not just what do we need for this next season. We've got to be thinking longer term. We need to be addressing the needs of those who drive this industry, which are our workforce members. Primarily at that time in 21, the conversation was about housing, which has been a long-term topic of conversation, but that rose to the top as something of interest for our workforce members. And then also thinking about how do we do a better job of engaging our community members? How do we bring the residents, whether they're full-time or if they're second homeowners, how do we bring them into that conversation and make them a part of thinking about what we want for tourism in this space? And those lessons are not necessarily only things that we need to know in the Outer Banks. Those are really universal truths for a lot of destinations. Think about Martha's Vineyard. Think about the ski towns in Colorado. Think about Napa Valley, all of these places where tourism has really come in as a driving economic force for good, lots of good things. We've also got to be making sure that our community comes along with us as a part of that journey. So 21 really laid the groundwork for me in terms of thinking about like, okay, these are the points we need to think about. This year, with the work I've been doing, I've been able to start focusing on some of those points and say, okay, let's actually start making some progress on those, and what are we actually going to do with them?
Because what we want to avoid, and what we've read in recent headlines in the past couple of years, is the backlash. If you don't get in front of that,
exactly.
Barcelona, I think, Venice, for example, that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. And in terms of best practices, you mentioned other destinations. I think you've studied Hawaii and ski resorts, for example. So you've done a lot of research outside of the Outer Banks to see what works, what doesn't work. We're not the only vacation destination to contend with and grapple with. How do we look at the immediate solutions, but then also when we talk about sustainability longer term, what do we want the Northern Outer Banks to look like in 5 or 10 years? So talk a little bit about what have you learned from other destinations who have been doing similar work?
Yeah, great question. Actually, there's one that I want to highlight. It's down in Florida, Palm Beaches, the Palm Beach area in Florida. They do a really fantastic job with community engagement, and they have built an entire role and emphasis for a staff member in their tourism office to focus on community engagement. And it's Sergio's position to be that face in the community to say, hey, this is what tourism does. He just wrote a great op-ed that went out in their local paper about how their tourism office is supporting things like sea turtle conservation. They use, their resources, their folks who can talk about these organizations and the connections that they have to help support those important environmental efforts. We also have seen in Colorado a big emphasis on finding ways to support workforce members through things like better transportation to work and housing for them, as well as thinking about their communication, lines of communication with workforce members and their tourism office. So how do we get their voice heard in those decision-making efforts? And these are all things that are pretty low cost. Like, it doesn't have to cost a lot of money to set up these lines of communication and to dedicate someone to doing that. It's just having someone's energy focused on those things. And it's hard. I mean, many tourism offices, their primary focus is marketing, and that is what they do best, and they are very good at it, and they are bringing in people, and they're sustaining the visitation that we need. We're seeing more and more of them say that's great, and we're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep focusing on the marketing, but we're also going to bring in almost more of an internal marketing effort to make sure that our residents, our business owners, our other stakeholders know what we're doing. And that's a really important element of that sustainable tourism approach, is saying we need people to know what we do, where we need help, and what we're doing well.
Whitney, we could talk about this for hours, which means we need to have you back. I did want to, we talked about this at the beginning of the conversation, that dual perspective, you and your partner and Lolly,
yes.
Beautiful fur baby. I've had the privilege of meeting. You've lived here now as a resident for almost a full year.
Yeah.
What have you learned? And I think from my perspective, more importantly, the difference in being a guest versus a local, right? Because you've been here, the seasonality of the Northern Outer Banks, the Outer Banks in general. We think of it primarily as a summer beach destination. Definitely. Lots of guests have discovered how beautiful it is during this shoulder season, even down to the sunrises and sunsets and colors of the cloud and sky. But for what a unique perspective and a dream come true for a lot of the guests who are listening. What has the last year been like for you, and how has your perspective, if at all, changed based on that experience?
Great question. And it is, coming to a close of this year. I'm definitely in that reflective mood of I'm getting ready to move back to Raleigh and what am I going to miss? And I think for me, one of the biggest things, having come from living in Raleigh, living in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina, where we have over 1 million residents, and you feel like a very small dot in the ocean of the Triangle area, versus being in a place like Corolla, where there's a few hundred residents in that area, and how you really start to build these connections with folks because you literally just see them all the time. If I'm in the coffee shop or I'm at Food Lion, or even if I'm on the beach, my husband's really gotten into surf fishing this year, and he's out on the beach all the time, and he'll come home and be like, oh yeah, I talked to Rex. Oh yeah, I ran into Megan. Like on the beach, you just see these folks all the time, and you sort of start to reorient yourself of who you are kind of in this universe of, if you're in a big place, you're one of millions. Here, you're one of hundreds, and you are an important part of that community, and you really feel that connection. And, as I was saying earlier about the way that the environment sort of shapes your connection to this space, makes you very aware of being in this space. So does knowing your neighbors and walking down the street and saying hello, not just because it's the polite thing to do, but because you're genuinely excited to see this person and hear about their day and catch up with them. It really is magical. And I grew up in a small town, so I know the flip side that, that everybody knows your business. And I had kind of thought that I was ready to move on from that point in my life, but coming back to a small town and being a part of it was truly amazing. And it just makes you appreciate the people who really make it a special place to be.
I'm glad you said that, because at the end of the day, when we talk about sustainable tourism, it's Rex, it's Megan, it's all the wonderful people who live here and work here, and they're the backbone of our visitor economy. Absolutely. And you have really had a front row seat as to what it takes to make that visitor economy work here in the Northern Outer Banks. Dr. Whitney Knollenberg, Associate Professor of Parks, Recreation, Tourism Management at North Carolina State University. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Truly my pleasure, Miles. Thanks so much for having me.
Here, wild horses roam windswept beaches, and the ocean stretches endlessly before you. Each sunrise brings a new adventure. Each breeze carries the salt and serenity of the sea. Climb our historic Red Brick Lighthouse. Savor fresh seafood and North Carolina barbecue. This is more than a vacation. It's a place that renews your spirit and keeps calling you back. Where in the Outer Banks? Only in the Northern Outer Banks.